That house is Dr. Henry's house many, many years ago. He was our mayor for many years. I don't know much about the house except that it's still in existence and quite nice.
The house was originally built by Mr. Filion from Huberdeau. In the 30s and 40s, Dr. Henry made many trips as far, well, we lived 7 miles away in Grey Valley, and my mother was looking after an elderly lady dying of cancer, and he made trips either daily or every second day to give her morphine and to help my mother by horse and sleigh and by horse and buggy, and the roads were almost impassable, and he came with his wife.
Dr. Henry was a doctor here for many, many years. He used to travel around with horse and sleigh and go to different homes. There would be people here who he delivered as babies. Dr. Henry came from the States and was part of this community for many, many years.
Well, I just remember that Dr. Henry would come when we were sick. He was our favorite doctor because he always prescribed Lyme Ricky.
He came when I fell off the dog's back, riding around on the dog's back on our veranda and knocked myself cold on the rock garden. He came immediately, as quickly as he could get there. By then, I believe he was driving. I was about 5, but I remember him coming, and I believe he was driving a car by then.
Both Dr. Henry and Dr. Flanagan had businesses right in that building, and all of my family went to them when they needed medical help or work done on their teeth for many years.
My son is sitting under a table in Dr. Flanagan's office in the upper part of this building. Dr. Flanagan has told my other son, who is having his teeth cleaned, that if you don't take care of your teeth, you're going to lose them.
Mon mari, leur demeure était à Montcalm et sa mère l'amenait chez le docteur Henry comme dentiste. Puis il se souvient que c'était une drille à pédale. Puis à ce jour, même aujourd'hui, mon mari se fait jamais geler. Il dit, le docteur Henry le faisait, lui, sans me geler, je suis capable de me faire réparer les dents sans me faire geler.
Moi, je pourrais te dire que Dr. Henry est venu même à notre maison avec sa femme pour soigner nos enfants. À un moment donné, il y avait la rougeole et puis ils sont venus tous les deux. C'était dans les dernières années qu'il pratiquait. Et j'ai des très bons souvenirs de Dr. Henry.
Well, this is Dr. Henry's place. He had his office in the lower main floor to the left as you walked in. And I stepped on a nail down at the John Miller was dismantling the old Percy Stanford building. I stepped on a nail, so in those days you simply went and saw the doctor, which I did immediately, and he took care of it right in the office, right there, cleaned it, gave me a shot for tetanus, and it's quite the experience, but it was resolved right away, you know.
It was Mr. Filion that owned this farm, all the acreage. I think there's 400 acres. He built this beautiful home, and then he had another home beside it for his hired help. Dr. Flanagan wanted to buy this farm, but he wouldn't sell it to Dr. Flanagan because he didn't want to sell it to a Protestant. So Dr. Flanagan went over to his friend, Joe Rishi in Huberdeau, and asked him if he would buy that farm for him. And he said, yes, sure I will. So he came over and he bought the Filion farm, and Dr. Flanagan bought it from Joe Rishi. That's how he got that farm. And this house, since he didn't need it, he sold the house to his brother-in-law, Dr. Henry. And he was a dentist in Montreal, He only come up on the weekends, so the other house was all he needed. But Dr. Henry, at that time, the doctor always went to your house. Like they do now, you got to go to the doctor. But at that time, the doctor came to your house. So he was known by everybody because he was a wonderful guy. And he finally decided he'd like to be mayor of the Arundel. So we voted for him and we put him in as mayor because he said, I want to get the roads in Arundel plowed, because he had to go by buggy or by sleigh in the winter. And he said that he had to get those roads plowed. So it was Dr. Henry, as a mayor, was able to get a grant or something, and we started plowing those roads in the winter. It was Dr. Henry that got that done.
This house was built by Mr. James Riddle, and he had a sawmill that was down below the falls, and McMahon's owned it later. Chris Goodfellow and presently owns it.
That house, when it was originally built, was of political importance, and I'm not sure what it was in that house. And the post office, yes. Well, that's what I'm saying. That's what it was used for originally. But it was a post office, eh?
The sawmill here, because of the falls, they built a dam, so they had a falls. That time, all the water and all the sawmills were run by water. And Alfred Privel, which is Roger Privel's grandfather, ran the falls, the sawmills, for quite a few years. Alfred Privel had 13 children. And because at that time, if you had 13 children, the government would give you a 100-acre bush lot. So Alfred Privel got a 100-acre bush lot, which was a big asset because he had a sawmill.
With the falls behind the house, you didn't hear many other noises because they were more powerful than the mosquitoes or the whatever that was around. The bedrooms on the back, where you heard the falls, you didn't hear anything else because of the falls. They aren't as near as big now as they were at that time even. Less water now.
It's just completely changed. The roof is different. It's completely changed. I have the identical picture of the old building, and it did not look like that. In my grandmother's time, this new owner has changed it.
My mother went to that school, as well as her sisters and brothers.
This school up on Thompson Road was the school that my grandmother attended in the late 1800s, I would say.
It has just been remodeled. There is a platform, or was a platform for the teacher to sit on. I think the window at the top is new.
My grandfather owned that building when I was a child. And when we came up in the summer, we always had to go up and board up the windows and clean up the damage from the vandals. And he sold it. And the last time I was in it, Mrs. Cantown was there. She invited me up to have a look. It's pretty neat.
Back in the beginning, the district of Arundel was divided into sections, and each one of them had their own schoolhouse. And that was the schoolhouse for the southern part of the community. And my mother and all of her sisters and brothers went to that school when they were young.
All your schools naturally went up to grade 7, from 1 to 7. But at that time, you had to have a school every 2 miles because it was against the law for anybody to have to walk further than 2 miles to school. When they decided that it was cheaper to build a school and haul the children rather than have all these schools with teachers in every one, they decided they'd build a school, but they wanted it in the middle of Arundel. And Arundel naturally starts from Crystal Falls, where that little Anglican church is, or not Anglican, but the Presbyterian church, all the way to the Beefeater. That was the Arundel. So they wanted to find out exactly the center. So they asked Morris's grandfather, Andy Rathwell, if he would measure it. So he went up to the Presbyterian church with his horse and buggy, and he tied a cloth or a handkerchief on one of the spokes of his buggy. And he counted all the wheels and revolutions from there to the beefeater. And he turned around and he counted it back. And halfway was Lake Barkmere Road. And that's why the school, and that house, there's a nice house in there now, but that's where they built the school. And that's where Morris's father and Jack Smith and some of them went to school. But that's why there's a school there. That is exactly the middle of Arundel. Yes, I took over this farm. I built that silo. There was a silo there, the red silo, but it was getting pretty dilapidated, so I pulled it down, and I got a couple of men to help me, and we built that silo. I went down to the bush, and I found a pine tree, 36 inches on the stump, and I got three 12-foot logs out of it, took it up to Berbeff, and I had the man up there saw it into timber, silo timber. They have to be all sloped and grooved. And we built the silo. And after we got it the silo built and we got it filled with silage, I went up and I put the roof on that silo. I never did that in my life. And I did that all by myself. And you're 30 feet off the ground. So I didn't want to do that when the silo was empty. So I did it when it was full. But up there, I worked with a buck saw, because you don't want to work up there with a chainsaw when you're 30 feet off the ground. But anyway, I don't know how I did it, but anyway, that's 45 years ago, and the roof is still on it. If I hadn't been a farmer, I would have been a carpenter, because I love building. So all the buildings in Stenson, the barn was 100 feet long and 45 feet wide. Right now it's 100 feet long, but it's 75 feet wide, because I have a big lean-to at the back and I have all this extra that I've put on. But what you see there, I built all that. And then I bought that cement silo. Of course, I couldn't build that, so they came and they built that for me. But then I put in, as you can see, there's a stable cleaner sticking out of there. That's a stable cleaner. You just push a button and the stable is cleaned. I ended up with a bulk tank in there, and I ended up with a pipeline milker, which you never see the milk. The milk goes into the bulk tank, and the trucker backs up and hooks onto it and sucks it out, so you never see the milk. But they test it so carefully, they make certain that the bacteria is very low, and they pay you on, at that time, they pay you on butterfat. Now they pay you on protein and butterfat, but you had to have a quota. So I had to keep buying quota to make sure, because I ended up, we always used to milk 19 cows. My father milked 19. I got up to 20, and then I got up to 24. But I built a stable for 24 head. And that's as big as I ever got, was 24 cows. And they had a Massey Ferguson with a loader on it. So it was a big change. But the big advantage in farming I found was hydraulics. Everything has gone hydraulics. That hay bine is lifted and lowered by hydraulics. And all the manure was loaded by hydraulics. So you never did any of this hard work. Before that, I loaded it all by hand. And that was a big job. You'd hire a guy to work with you, and he'd come at 9 o'clock, and we'd load by hand till 12. Then we'd go back at 1 o'clock, and we'd go till 5. And then he was tired, he'd go home. But I still had 2 hours work to do, milking the cows and feeding everything after that. But I toughed it, and I'm here. I'm 83 years old, and I'm still living, so I figure it didn't kill me.
Morris talks about the jeweler. He was Lowton Evans, my husband's grandfather, and he worked, in younger days, worked in Burke's in Montreal, he and his brother. And he was a diamond setter, and many of the family members have rings and brooches and things that he made.
When they were talking about bees, whether it was for building or whether it was for thrashing their oats or whatever it was, all the neighboring farmers would help each other. So they'd meet at one farm one day, the next day another farm and whatnot. And when any of them needed to do building repairs or building work, they would again call in their neighbors and they would all come and help to do it.
This is the farm of the first settler in Arundel. I think it was William. Was it William Thompson? And one of his he has an ancestor who still owns the property, and it had a wonderful maple bush behind. He loved his trees and took great care of the maple bush. And behind the barn is the foundation of the original silo that was there. But it was a large property on the hill that overlooks the valley.
This is the Canadian Legion at Arundel, and originally it was an orange lodge.
When we were children, we lived in the village of Arundel, and it was great fun to go up to the Orange Lodge. But the windows were boarded because they had sort of secret meetings, I guess. But we were always told, don't go there because there's a goat in there. Well, we were too naive to realize a goat couldn't live in there by itself. So some of the kids would try to peek in through the boards, but we didn't see anything.
Orange Lodge was closed for quite a number of years. And when it was closed, my brothers were trappers, and they used to set traps under the building and catch skunks because they sold them in the market. And one morning, one of them got peed on, and they went to school. The smell was so bad, they sent one of the brothers home, but they sent the wrong one home. It was the other one that got peed on, and they had to put up with him all day in school. After it was closed for a number of years, it was then sold to the Legion to start the Royal Canadian Legion, and it was two of our citizens, Art Batty and Harold Gordon, who were on the executive of the Legion, who were involved in the purchase of that building for the Legion. All of the men who fought during the war and whatnot, and we still have regular suppers and other meals, and I've been a member for many years. I go to all of the suppers and whatnot, or whatever they put on, to show my respect to the veterans and whatnot. But today, they are almost all gone.
My parents belonged to the church, and of course, all his kids had to go to church every Sunday morning. And the biggest thing I remember is just playing the Christmas pageants, just participating in those, and the strawberry tea party every July, of course. And there's a lot of fun had in that church.
This church is a great part of my life because I lived at my grandfather's across the street, the parking lot now for Gilbert Miller. But we had great times there with lawn socials and everything, where Margaret Sevigny would teach us all kinds of good stuff. And yeah, my grandfather was instrumental, David Staniforth, in the building of this second church. And his coffee table is in there with a plaque on it. My mother received the key to this church on her 21st birthday, which I got, and then my eldest son has now.
Today is my wedding day, July 28th, 1951, and I'm being married in that church. Well, it was a beautiful day. It is a beautiful day, and my wedding reception is going to be held just up the street beside the post office, and we had a wonderful time. When
I was very young in the early 40s, we had lawn socials, but they were held at night, and the grounds were lighted by strings of electric lights, and on occasion there would be a movie. And as I remember, the movies sometimes during wartime were pretty scary pictures from the World War II.
We lost our cat Willie before church. I was very depressed, about maybe 7, 8, or 9 years of age. So I went to church. I sat in the back pew and cried throughout the whole sermon.
As a young person, my family, of course, were members of that church, and I went to Sunday school there every Sunday, all the years I was growing up. And my grandparents, who were much involved in the building and work in that church back around 1900 and in that area, and both of my grandparents are buried in the graveyard right there, not far off the front of the church now.
This is my church, the church that I was baptized in. I've since probably adopted the other church, so people will ask, where do I belong? But I remember as a child coming with my brothers and sister to this church and my parents, and being given a very our mother is looking at me with a cross expression on her face, because my brother and I have been talking very quietly, we thought, but she's caught us. And then I dropped my change for the collection, and that rolled across the wooden floor and made a whole noise. I remember after the Cooks, somebody, I think Pascal, bought this building in order to have hardware store. And you could come in. I used to do a lot of riding as a child, and I'd come in and we'd get rivets for piecing together pieces of harness, and you could get anything there for the farm, or for a lot of the farm anyway, and harness equipment. And as a child, I remember also getting black balls, because they would sell candies, and the black balls were hard, multicolored candies, bonbons, that would switch colors as you sucked them. I'm not a candy sucker, but those you did, just to get the different colors coming out of the candies. They tasted wonderfully well too.
This building was built by the Cook brothers, and they had a feed store in there, and they had a grocery store, and they had a bank. Right where we are was a bank. Then they wanted to sell it. Well, they sold it. They had at one time 10,000 laying hens, and they sold it to this fellow, and he got up to 20,000 laying hens. But then he decided he wanted to sell it, and he put it on he put it up for sale. And they wanted $30,000 for it. Well, the council wanted to buy it. Huey Boyd, that was his pet thing. He wanted to get that and make it into apartments and all that. He wanted to buy it for the council. The council had the $30,000, but they couldn't get permission to buy it unless they went to Quebec. And by the time we got back the permission from Quebec, the sale, put it on real estate. The real estate, it had so long, and at the end of that, it could go for any price you liked. So Huey Boyd, he went to Gilbert Miller, and he asked Gilbert Miller if he would buy it for $30,000 for the council, and when the council got permission, that he would sell it back to us for $30,000. So that's what we did. Gilbert bought this building for $30,000, and when it was, we got the permission from Quebec to buy it, he sold it back to us for $30,000. But then we found out that the council couldn't make apartments and all that. It's against the law for the council, because the council can't make money. They can only collect enough money, pay the taxes and a little bit over. So they had to have a committee. So they formed a committee, and there was 4 councillors on it and 3 non-councillors. And I was the chairman of that for 28 years. And we rented out the apartments to people. But it all had to go through our committee. Even though the council owned the place, they weren't allowed to run it unless they had a committee under them to do it. So we rent it, and we're still renting it, and it's still full, and there's still a waiting list to get in, because we had to have someone build it. So Mr. Stewart, Judy's father, he was willing to build it, to put it into apartments. And so he donated all the money that it took to build that place into 8 apartments, and down here to have the beautiful office here and the library on the other side. So it was Mr. Stewart that gave us the money and had built all that. He didn't give us the money, he built it, and he paid for everything. So it's because of Mr. Stewart that we were able to have what you see right in front of you.
When I first came to Arundel in 1952, I slept in this house, and stayed there for a month and a half before I went to where I was boarding. My husband worked on this building. At one time, it was a granary and feed store. It has been a bank. It's been many different things.
The original cook was Jim Cook, and he had a boarding house. He ran the switchboard office for the bell, for the telephone. It wasn't bell then, but my mother worked there when she was 18, 19, 20 years old for Jim Cook. He had a general store at one time, and he came in one day. He was a very good-natured man, Jim Cook. He came in one day scratching his head, and he said, "You know what happened? Jingles, jingles, pussy fell in the molasses barrel." His favorite saying was jingles, jingles. Pussy fell in the molasses barrel, because they had the barrels of big, huge wooden puncheons of molasses, and someone had left the lid open, and the cat fell in.
The Cook family came from the United States, and they were very much business-oriented people. I don't know where they came from Europe, but pretty well all the other residents of Arundel came from Ireland, and they were all very poor people. And so they started with farms and making a living the way they could. But the Cooks were very much interested, and they started the first telephone, they started the first they started all of those things. And it was part of their business orientation from the beginning. In the early years of the train, all of the people who owned summer cottages on the lakes in this area, their wives and children would come up and stay all summer. And their husbands would come on the train on Friday night and go back on Sunday. And that is, at that time, there was no other way to get to those cottages. So the families were here all summer.
When I was about 3 or 4, I took that train from Arundel into, I think it was obviously Montreal, whatever the case may be. I remember that well, but I have a cask at home. It's called a sugar cask, and it's got Thomas's Graham's writing on it. And that thing, according to my dad, it would come up on the train full in the fall of sugar. And that cask of sugar would have to last the family for the winter, because in the spring it was empty and it would head back down into town for a recharge. So their allocation of sugar for the wintertime basically came up by train.
Oh, the train brought a lot to Arundel. I remember I got my first ballpoint pen when somebody came up, or bubble gum. And my aunt had the restaurant in town, and the ice cream came up with what's it called, dry ice, and then we'd throw the ice down that hill. It seemed much bigger then than it does now, and watch the smoke. Yeah, good memories. Put lots of petties on the track.
Interesting thing about that train, it came in here at 10 o'clock on Friday night, and it left at 8 o'clock in the morning. So people coming up here at night, they didn't get into Arundel till 10 o'clock. And this building we're in right now, which was owned by the Cook brothers, I forget what they called it right then, but the citizens who stayed here overnight, it was a pretty cold spot, and they called it the iceberg before they got their ride back to the lake the next morning.
I grew up on a farm outside of the village, and the tracks were just in front of our house, and the train, we could hear, the train signal was too long and too short whistles, and it was the same as our phone. And I remember, well, we used to run, I'm running out to the to the tracks because I hear the whistle at the corner, and I run out just in order to put some nails on the tracks.
During the winter, the roads weren't open to get to the city, so anything, as Morris says, that came into the village had to come by train.
That's Herbie Cook's house. It used to be a boarding house. That's where my father met my mother. She used to come up there all the time to board in the summertime. And they built a dam down below so that these people that wanted there's about 10 rooms in that house. They all went down to swim in this dam. And it just happens that that's where I met my wife too, same house. But it's a beautiful big farmhouse. It's been all decorated, as you can see now. But it was one of the boarding houses in Arundel. There are a lot of people who know they've lived there and they've been boarders in that house. But they had to come up by train, but it wasn't bread and breakfast. There you were served 3 meals a day. And of course, people loved to go there because they got the real old farm meals. They got 3 good meals a day, and they'd come for 2 weeks, but they'd have to come up with the train. But there was always a kind of a taxi from the train up, and that's how these people would get there, and then they'd take the taxi back.
I had heard the same story many times about the Cook family way back and about their wife walking all the way down to Grenville area and to visit family people once a year or whatever when the weather was right in the spring. And I can't imagine how they got there. It was a long journey.
And she used to walk to Grenville from Arundel. Yeah. And take her a day to do it. And she would walk from here to Grenville. We all know what it's like to drive. She walked it. Amazing.